Welcome to the CSAC webinar on the governor's budget proposal. Today, we're really going to focus on what counties should be looking at and focusing on for the state budget. We're going to have our whole team go through it. I first want to thank you for participating, and then talk about the budget process just for a minute. So as the governor released his budget a couple of weeks ago now, the budget hearings in Sacramento have started. There are some early actions that are underway, which Chris Lee and Marina Espinoza will talk about in our HLT group. But there is two things that the administration is working on, right? So they wanted some early budget action, and then they wanted some March budget action, and then the June 15th budget action. That is a new process for everybody. So what is happening is the budget committees are meeting to take some of the early action. The rest of the budget subcommittees are starting to hear all of the other issues. And then those will happen from February through May. Then the governor will come out with the May revise on May 15th, I think, or 12th. And then from there, the legislature will kind of look at all of those proposals quickly, and then there'll be a month of the budget negotiations with a passage on June 15th. The administration has asked, like I said, for early budget action in January, some March action in the budget, and then the regular process. I'm not sure that there'll be a March budget action. I think the legislature thinks there are things that can be rolled over and be done in June versus through the middle of March, but that is still yet to come. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to start with Jeff Neal and Ada Wilder in our office to start about the overall revenues in the budget and the budget perspective, and then go into the governance, finance, and revenue overview first. So Jeff, I'm going to kick it to you. Oh, sorry, I forgot one other thing. We are going to be taking, there's a question and answer box. If you have questions during the presentation, please type your questions in. We'll try to get to them as we're doing the presentation, but at the end, we'll save some time to answer questions. And if we don't get to them all, we'll try to answer them at a later time. So please start, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Just going to go over, as Darby said, some of the budget fundamentals, if you will. There's the governor, as the governor's proposing it, and as the Department of Finance is estimating revenues and expenses, they're looking at about a $227 billion total budget for the budget year, 165 billion in the general fund. That includes a bunch of money that's going into the constitutionally required reserves. Almost $19 billion will be in reserves at the end of the fiscal year, which is $7.5 billion more than they thought when they enacted the budget in June. Obviously, that's a big difference. As many of you know, in your communities, the pandemic has caused a lot of challenges, but a lot of them are not the ones we anticipated when all this was going on. We didn't know how things were going to go, and as it turned out, the state's revenues, in the short term anyway, have continued doing very well, frankly, compared to the apocalyptic estimates that were being made in the spring and early summer. So what that amounts to is, while in the long term, they're still estimating that there are going to be persistent deficits for the state budget, growing to just over $11 billion in 2024-25. For right now, between the amount that they didn't lose in the current year and the amount they expect to get in the budget year, they have about estimated about $15.5 billion in one-time money being called the windfall. And so, of course, a lot of the discussions are over how to spend that money. And in fact, just to put a finer point, over the 3-year period, the previous year, the current year, and the budget year, there's actually $70 billion more than they were projecting when they were putting the budget together last year. Now, a lot of that has to go to constitutionally required places, the reserves. Prop 98, of course, eats up a lot of it, but it's still a remarkable difference from where we thought we were in May and June last year. But they still, of course, have to solve for the out-year deficit problems. And so that's where a lot of the tension right now is. How much do we spend now? How much of it is in ongoing programs? And we're still, of course, wondering what are the best ways to respond to the pandemic, both economically and health-wise. So a lot of the governor's proposals are in that area. A lot of the money for one-time spending that the governor was proposing would go to schools. At $2 billion for a reopening plan that has met significant resistance from most sides, both from the teachers and the districts, many of whom are saying reopening the way that they'd be required to do would cost more than they would get under that plan. But even more than that, about $4.5 billion for extended learning opportunities. So I know these are things that a lot of the folks in your communities are talking about. Obviously, even though counties don't do schools directly, this is what a lot of the discussion is at the local level that I'm seeing both here and around the state. The governor's also proposing some economic stimulus measures, sort of similar to what we've seen the federal government do in some of their coronavirus relief efforts. $600 checks to low-income workers, essentially, through, if you will, through EITC type qualifications. And then also he's proposing $575 million for small businesses and for nonprofit cultural organizations as a relief to try and keep them from going under. And then a lot smaller number, but significant for the folks who would get it, is fee relief for certain state fees for hard-hit industries like restaurants, et cetera. So as Darby said, the governor's requesting immediate action on, he's actually asking for 3 sets of action. Immediate action, I think he was hoping it would be done by now. I think he said late January in his initial budget. That hasn't happened, but maybe early February. Then another round of very quick action still in the spring. And then of course the usual budget timeline for the rest of it. And so that quick action amounts to about $11 billion in of his proposals, which the legislature has been pretty open to some of it. A lot of folks looking for small business relief, for example, but a fair amount of resistance as well. I already mentioned the resistance to part of the school opening plan, but there was also a fair amount of money in the governor's proposal for electric vehicle and hydrogen fueling. And I think a lot of legislators were left wondering why that is as important right now as some of the pandemic relief and the other needs around the state. And they made that those questions known to him in some of the budget hearings and of course on Twitter, where most of our policy debates take place these days. So moving on to some of the more government finance and administration policy committee items, really just a couple of things I want to bring up. One of them is that the governor's budget always includes revenue estimates for some of the important revenues, and sales and use tax, while it did not decline the way we thought it would this year, they're still expecting to decline budget year at about 2.5%. And so while of course that affects the state's general fund, it also affects, of course, your general funds with earns, but also Prop 117, the realignment programs. So it's in the air, nobody really knows, but they are projecting a 2.5% decline. Of course, one of the things that propped up the economy and a lot of our revenues this year was the federal relief that came in the middle of last year. And if there is another large influx of federal relief, that could do the same again this coming year. Wasn't in the governor's budget was an estimate of the property tax losses for wildfires, which we look for every year to make sure that those property tax losses are covered. It wasn't in the budget, but the Department of Finance has indicated that they just didn't have reliable estimates at the time they were putting the budget together. Of course, we know it was another historic fire season, and it has reached out to, we think, all the counties that had fire emergencies, and are trying to make sure we get those numbers in the future version of it. Hard to know how much it is now, but please do reach out to us if you haven't heard from us, or if maybe it's somebody else in your office we contacted. And then lastly, there are 2 tax proposals that the governor put in his budget that would affect local agencies. One is a property tax forgiveness, essentially, for electric vehicle and hydrogen fueling facilities. It would exempt them from property tax for 10 years. Obviously, property tax is something the state directly benefits from. And then the other one is a doubling to $200 million from $100 million of certain manufacturing equipment purchases that of course affects the sales tax. As an existing program and an expansion of it. So happy to talk about any of those, and we'll look through the chat for the questions and answer those as we can. But now we're going to move along to agriculture and natural resources.
Yes, we're going to go to Catherine with our A&R committee. And if we can go through the questions as you're going to see if we can answer any of them. Thanks, Catherine.
Sounds good. And if you can't hear me, somebody raise a hand. So my name is Catherine Freeman, and I'll be giving you the A&R budget breakdown. In general, the governor's budget provides funding to locals across a number of different areas. Most of it's in the way of one-time funding, and this is not unusual. So I'm going to cover the highlights, but I just want to make sure folks know there's a lot there, and I'm available for questions if you want to connect directly. And the governor has a couple proposals that we're still continuing to review, which is code for we have some concerns, but we'll be reaching out to the membership to ask for some suggestions on these. So let's dive right in. Wildfire, forest resilience. So back in 2019, county government leaders and stakeholders started meeting regularly with the administration on the Forest Management Task Force to provide input to the state's Forest Resilience Action Plan. It was finished this fall, which is great, and the plan was actually released with the governor's budget and includes $1 billion of one-time general fund investments for forest resilience, with about $323 million of it proposed for that early action funding. And we've been strong supporters of the acceleration of wildfire and forest resilience funding. A few specific items that I wanted to highlight, there is $130 million over the 2-year period for fire prevention grants, $85 million for regional forest and fire capacity, and $25 million for home hardening. So we hope that those will go out directly to counties and our member partners. So turning to the California Disaster Assistance Act, I'm trying to keep in themes, but it's not going to work. The budget includes a much needed $256 million of one-time general fund to assist local governments during and after emergency events. The funding is used for repair, restoration, or replacement of public property that was destroyed during disaster events, and it is reimburses local governments for emergency activities, and this is specific to under declared states of emergencies. There's a number of legislative proposals out there to change what is under a declared state of emergency, but we won't be doing that under this webinar. The next is cap and trade funding. So after a major pause in funding because of the uncertainty of markets, revenues returned to the cap and trade program, and the budget includes an allocation of $1.4 billion in cap and trade funding. So the funding is focused on forest health and fuels reduction, air quality programs, and low carbon transportation. Notably, it has no funding for waste diversion to CalRecycle to help with our organic waste diversion requirements. And so on that front, we were a little surprised not to see any proposals in this area to support local governments. As many of you are aware, CSAC's been working on this with our member partners for the past couple of years. And it's the implementation of SB 1383, which requires organic waste diversion in our waste stream after a very lengthy regulatory process in which the rules were late, They just came out about a year late. No changes were made to how soon we need to implement the law. So we talked about there's no actual funding support from cap and trade. Instead, the administration redirects positions from local assistant to enforcement. So needless to say, this is something we plan to discuss with the administration and the budget committees as it goes forward, and it's critical to some of our local partners. The next, turning to completely shifting gears. So floods and water, everybody knows it's my favorite subject. So if this week is any indication, changing weather patterns are really impacting how we look at planning and for all types of disasters, including flood. And CSAC has been a strong partner for everybody in getting funding out to locals statewide. The budget has $183 million for ongoing flood management programs. It includes flood risk management, emergency flood response, and state federal flood projects, which is great, but these are bond funds and general fund, and as they run out, we really need to think about what the next step is. But for now, this is a good slug of money. And then in keeping with water, the A&R team's been working over the past year with the Department of Water Resources to kind of ramp up the state and county relationship because counties are part of the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. This shifted the role of groundwater management to locals, and counties are like a critical part of this. As changes happen for groundwater management, there's going to be big changes in future land use decisions, including possible fallowing or land conversion or any other things, and that's a county responsibility. So we were happy to see $60 million for SGMA grants, and it's for local economic mitigation planning, groundwater implementation, and I'm pleased to say that DWR really recognizes the role of counties here, and we're going to try to continue to help them understand how we work with groundwater. On another front, and it's not as fun, the network of fairs. So we've talked about the critical need for fairgrounds to be available for statewide, local and statewide emergencies. We know they're being used now for COVID, they're being used for wildfires. Most of the fairs across the state had some form of closure, if not full closure, and funding has been needed from the state to prop up the fairs as they are essentially just in layoff processes. So the governor's budget has a one-time $50 million allocation to support state-affiliated fairground costs. And I think this is one of the first times I've seen this, $10 million for deferred maintenance at fairgrounds that are specifically used for emergency operations. It doesn't indicate what the future state-local fair relationship is going to be, but this really is a good indicator of some support from the state for these fairs. So I'm going to go over two other proposals. These are the ones that are not fully fleshed out and that we have some questions about for the administration and the budget committees. The first one is the Department of Toxic Substances Control. The legislature has had numerous reform proposals for this department to improve stewardship of public resources around toxic substances. And there's so many areas of the state that are impacted by this. The two main funds in this program have structural deficits, and it's created huge problems for how the program is managed. So the governor is proposing a comprehensive reform. There's also legislation to do similar activities, and it changes statutory fee authority for the program. Everything is sort of phased in. So the budget includes $35 million to prop up the two main funding sources. But also, I think what we're really interested in is the creation of a 5-member board of environmental safety that would set fees through regulation. They would hear permit appeals, provide guidance to the department. And I think what we want to do is make sure that the county voice is heard on that board. So we'll be discussing that with our partners. And finally, and I didn't set my timer, so I'm supposed to stop soon, cannabis. So in 2020, the governor's budget included a proposal to consolidate state cannabis operations into one entity, the Department of Cannabis Control. It was put on hold due to the pandemic, but it's back. And the trailer bill should be out, if not today, it should be out soon. So currently, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, Department of Food and Ag, and Department of Public Health all share responsibilities for this, for regulating cannabis. And it's been our long position that any kind of like consolidation or regulatory reform would be really helpful. We're also hoping to see some activity to support the California Cannabis Authority, which was developed to manage data for counties as they interact with the industry and also the state. But we don't see that in the budget. But we will be following this consolidation pretty carefully, and we'll see what happens next. And I did not pay attention to the chat while I was doing this, but I would be happy to answer any questions when the time is right.
I don't think there were any specific to A&R, so we'll keep going and come back to the questions that are in the chat at the end. So now we'll go to Josh and Stanisha with our Administration of Justice Committee.
Hi, everybody. This is Josh Gauger with Administration of Justice. I'm going to start by answering one question I just noticed popped up in the chat. Otherwise, I may forget by the end of my segment. So forgive me for going a little out of turn or on a roller coaster here. The updated Department of Finance estimates for 2011 realignment revenues actually show growth funds in the current year in 2020-21. So as most of you are aware, last year, 2019-20 was the first year that 2011 realignment revenues did not fulfill the base allocation. So there was no growth funding. But this year, it's currently projected to fulfill those base sub-accounts and then spill over into some growth. So as that relates to the community corrections sub-account, which funds AB 109, which was the question, there's expected to be at this point $76 million in growth for that sub-account. And we are working on finishing up, CSAC does the county by county estimates after the release of the governor's budget and the May revision. And we are finishing up those estimates and hope to have those out to counties by the end of this week so that each county can see what their projected share of that 76 million would be in the current year. So that being said, moving on to some other issues I just wanted to briefly highlight. I'll start with homelessness. The governor's budget frames a $1.75 billion investment in homelessness. This year, the homelessness funding is kind of more focused on infrastructure and, consistent with the prior home key effort, really looks at purchase and acquisition of facilities that can be rehabilitated into various forms of housing. So of that 1.75 billion, 750 million of it is to continue efforts related to Project Home Key specifically. And the budget asks for 250 million of that to be actually allocated in the current year and not wait for the budget year. My colleagues in the Health and Human Services unit will cover the other components of that 1.75 billion that are focused on residential care facilities for the elderly and behavioral health facilities. So moving along from homelessness, one other investment we see in the administration of justice area that we think is really important that we plan to be supporting this year is the proposal around $50 million for county probation departments. The budget really frames this as an investment that builds upon the success of probation departments implementing prior major criminal justice reforms as we now prepare to implement new reforms related to the Division of Juvenile Justice Realignment and AB 1950 from last year, which changes the felony probation term lengths and could have some impacts on existing funding streams like SB 678, the Community Corrections Performance Incentive Grant Program, and may require some front loading of services. And so the budget includes this $50 million one-time investment to build on the success of county probation departments and set us up for continued success with these new programs. Beyond that, really wanted to mention, segueing into DJJ realignment from last year, SB 823, there's not a whole lot in the governor's initial budget tied to it, but you may recall that the implementing legislation did call for further legislation by March of this year that would create a separate secure treatment facility track, if you will, for kind of higher needs youth or youth that commit the most serious or violent crimes to provide courts and judges some assurances that certain youth will be given certain treatment plans and certain levels of treatment to prevent against additional transfers to the adult court system. So we expect some language on that soon as March is rapidly approaching. We've also been working with the state to identify needed cleanup legislation tied to SB 823. So we're also hopeful that we'll see some of those issues included in this legislation. Some of that cleanup related to things that we've been tracking as potential issues from SB 823 around the way counties will receive payments on an ongoing basis for DJJ realignment implementation, potential reassurances around the way the formula will be kind of reopened and evaluated in 2024-25. And we know there was some just kind of drafting issues late in the process related to the legislation, given the way it came together. So a few little pieces here and there that would clarify that probation departments can in fact receive this funding. As I know that there was unfortunately some confusion or concern about that. It's definitely been our position from the beginning that not only can they receive it, but in most cases, probation would be the lead entity implementing DJJ realignment. So we're hopeful that the state will also clarify some of that. There's a few other, little pieces here and there that we're hopeful that we'll see, and we'll certainly keep everybody apprised of those developments once language is made available. And then I think that pretty much covers my piece, but I wanted to turn it over to Stanisha Boatner from the AOJ team to quickly cover some a proposal that's resurfaced tied to ability to pay and fines and fees as kind of a continuation of the legislature and the administration's push to reduce criminal justice fines and fees. If you want to take it over, Stanisha.
Thanks, Josh. So the governor's January budget proposal includes 12.3 million general fund in 21-22, and it increases to 58.4 million ongoing general fund by 24-25. And this funding is to expand the current court pilot program that offers individuals an ability to pay option for infraction fines and fees. This proposal is partially designed to further recommendations from the Chief Justice's Futures Commission in an effort to simplify court processes. This proposal also builds upon a pilot program in the 2018 Budget Act, which implemented online traffic adjudication and the ability to pay to 8 counties. And the pilot courts are Shasta, Tulare, Ventura, San Francisco, Santa Clara, Fresno, and Monterey. The 8th court pilot is yet to be determined. This is a very similar proposal to the administration and judicial branch's proposal last year that was ultimately not included in the legislature's final budget, as the legislature approved the approach included in AB 1869. Like last year, this year's proposal includes a backfill of lost trial court revenue at the state level, but does not include funding to backfill local revenue impacts, which we expect to be roughly equal to that of the trial courts, which is approximately $50 million according to the proposal. And in line with CSAC's criminal justice fines and fees priority, CSAC will continue to work closely on this proposal and partner with the administration and the legislature on a formula for the backfill funds included in last year's AB 1869. And that's it.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Denisha. I just wanted to add on to that the references to 1869 that, like Denisha said, we're going to continue to work on that. I know we get a lot of questions about it, the way that that legislation eliminates the criminal justice fees on a prospective basis beginning in July and included backfill funds, but those backfill funds are actually included in this proposed budget for next fiscal year and didn't include an actual formula. So we're going to continue to work closely on what that formula should be and how that $65 million per year would actually go out county by county. So thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you. And I would just, before we kick it over to our Health and Human Services team, I just would note how difficult it is at this time to really be lobbying on a lot of these issues because the legislature is acting remotely. You can't go in person to talk with people. We're required to kind of call and email staff to get it. And so as these are issues that are in the budget and people are focusing on them, the Health and Human Services team, which has like the COVID, which is urgent and everybody is focused on, that gets a little more attention. But these other issues, which are key priorities, it has become a very difficult in 10 months into COVID to really get with the legislature and the administration on these policies. So I just wanted to note that really quick. So Justin, Roshina, and Farah, kick it off.
Hey everyone, Justin Garrett, Legislative Representative for Human Services, and I'll kick it off for the HHS team. I'm going to start first with realignment revenues. Josh talked about a little bit. I'll talk about the HHS impacts. So as we know, in 2019-20, realignment revenues failed to hit base both for 1991 and 2011, falling about 3% on 91 side, 1% on 2011. CSAC was successful in advocating for the realignment backfill, which really helped counties be able to preserve the safety net. So that was a good success. And as of now, the Department of Finance projections in the governor's budget, they show that realignment revenues will come back this year. They anticipate a 5.6% growth in 2021 above the 1920 levels. So looking at HHS realignment growth, this would project out to $341 million in 91 growth, fully covering caseload growth on the social services side. And then for 2011 growth, $188 million on the support services side. So the unfortunate side is then in 21-22, they predict that realignment revenues will go down by 1.9%. So, obviously this was a huge top budget priority for CSAC last year. We'll continue to closely monitor the actual realignment revenues as we get further along in the realignment fiscal year. Next, I want to talk about the master plan for aging. So the master plan was released 2 days before the budget. CSAC, counties, partner organizations have been heavily involved in this throughout the development of the master plan over the past, really year and a half. So excited to see this master plan come out. A lot of really good positive initiatives to improve the health and well-being of older adults, and many that will directly involve counties. So it's a 10-year plan, but there's a whole set of 100+ initiatives outlined for implementation in the first 2 years. A couple are identified, in the state budget. So there's $250 million for preventing homelessness among older adults as part of that overall homelessness package that Josh talked about. This specific pot of funding would be used for the acquisition of adult residential facilities and residential care facilities for the elderly. We've had some conversations with the State Department of Social Services to learn more about this. There's still, details, full plans being worked out, but, they're talking about expanding housing options for those on SSI, preserving current beds, and preventing homelessness among older adults. So an important opportunity here. There's some other key implementation funding for some of the master plan initiatives in the budget. One of the really big ones is not identified in the budget, but it will be something that CSAC works closely on with HHS agency and Department of Aging. Relates to the local leadership structure for AAA's services and aging services in terms of an opportunity for counties to have flexibility in how those services are administered. So this is an ongoing conversation and one that CSAC and counties will be involved with as we look to see if there's any improvements we can make on that front. Next, I want to talk about in-home supportive services. Some positive news on the county administration funding for IHSS. The governor's budget proposes to end the freeze that was included for county admin for the current year. So this would result in $17.8 million more in county admin funding in 21-22. And then CSAC will have an IHSS collective bargaining proposal that we're sponsoring, partnering with CAPA, CWDA, UCC, RCRC, and the 2 IHSS provider unions, UDW and SEIU. The goal of this proposal is to provide continuity for the current IHSS collective bargaining tools that have been so successful in recent years. We've seen 24 new agreements just in the first 18 months of the new MOE, on top of about 20 agreements in the 2-year 2017 IHSS MOE. A big part of that is these 4 tools that have come together to make it more workable for counties. Unfortunately, on January 1st, 2022, 2 of those tools are set to change in a manner that's going to make it more difficult to reach agreements. The sharing ratio will change so that the state will pay less of the non-federal costs and counties will pay more. And then there's a tool that allows the county to get the state to participate in some of those higher wage increases that will go away as well. So our proposal is that those tools would maintain in their current form instead of changing on January 1st, 2022. We are hopeful to have county support on this as well. So we're going to get out some resources soon that will provide more information about this proposal so that everyone can learn and support if your county is interested in that. So those are the 3 main things on the human services side. Lots of other good investments in child welfare related to some of the COVID-19 impacts. For CalFresh in terms of responding to the increases in caseload with county admin funding. But with that, I'll turn it over to Farah, who will talk next for the HHS team.
Thank you, Justin. I'm Farah McDade-Ting, 1/3 of the HHS team representing the HHS Policy Committee here at CSAC. And I'm going to cover health and behavioral health topics and then kick it over to Rashina on our team. And I'm going to go pretty rapidly. Since we're focusing only on state budget impacts in this webinar, for COVID relief, I will stick to state budget proposals. The governor's January 10 budget proposed $372 million for a very vaguely defined COVID-19 vaccination and response efforts. We have asked for the lion's share of that $372 million, but those discussions are still underway. It's a very complex interplay between what counties are doing on COVID right now, especially with vaccinations, but all the other things we've been doing. And braiding the funding streams, including the CARES Act funding, if you still have some left, the new federal funding coming down, as well as FEMA and other funding streams. So for the state budget, we're focusing on that $372 million. We have joined with CHEAC and HOAC and the urban counties and the rural counties in asking for, again, the lion's share of that $372 million to be used as flexibly as possible. We've also joined on a budget ask, a separate one for more than $300 million for our public hospital system, which are seeing increased costs from having more patients, number one, but Medi-Cal fee-for-service patients, the county or the county hospital puts up 100% of the cost for those patients first, and then they get reimbursed from the federal government, and we need some help with the cash flow on that issue. So those are some of the things we're focusing on. There's this epidemiology and lab funding, ELC funding, that was allocated by the federal government last summer. Counties have 2 years to spend that funding, and that funding is starting to go out now. The most recent federal funding bill may provide more funding. And the reason I mention all that is because we're working with the Department of Finance here in California to figure out exactly what counties need. Where are the gaps? What funding can we use right now, today, to help us with everything we're struggling with? Lastly, on the homelessness side, the governor proposed an astounding $750 million for a behavioral health housing continuum grant program. It would be a 3-year grant, competitive grant program for counties to buy, build, refurbish behavioral health related housing. That's everything from board and cares and sober living homes up to potentially locked psychiatric facilities. So we're working with DHCS on that proposal, and it's one big piece of the overall housing and homelessness proposals in the budget. I'm going to kick it over to Rashina now. We're happy to take questions in the question and answer box.
Hi everyone, Rashina Dury with the Health and Human Services team. I'm going to start off with one of the bigger investments in the January budget, and it's for the California Advancing and Innovating in Medi-Cal proposal. Most of you know it as Cal-AIM. This was announced in 2019, and CSAC played a significant role in the initial stakeholder engagements. This investment will include $1.1 billion in 2022 fiscal year. And it goes up to 1.5 billion to support the new enhanced care management and in lieu of services benefits. And this will be a part of the Medi-Cal managed care plans beginning January 1st, 2022. Funding will also be going towards behavioral health improvements, such as behavioral health payment reform that will be discussed further in the given years. Additionally, there's funding for student behavioral health services. There's one-time funding of $400 million for the Department of Healthcare Services to implement an incentive program for Medi-Cal managed care plans. The goal is for the plans to coordinate with county behavioral health departments as well as school districts in order to build a statewide infrastructure and partnership for preventative and early intervention behavioral health services for students. This will be a cross-system partnership really focused on increasing the access to behavioral health. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that there'll be a lot of issues that come up with students and the need for behavioral health services and expansion in that area. Lastly, there's going to be some expansions in both telehealth and MHSA funding. This is some of the flexibilities that were granted to counties during the pandemic will be made permanent and made statewide with the budget proposal of $94.8 million to expand those flexibilities. This will also coverage a new remote patient monitoring benefit for Medi-Cal beneficiaries, and that will be effective July 1st, 2021. That's still being fleshed out and more details are to come, but we'll be working with the Department of Healthcare Services on those details. And that rounds up the HHS team.
Thank you. Amazing. Okay. I do want to note that people are getting, some questions are being answered directly to people who are, know who to contact. I know others have been addressed in the presentation, so we'll hit them after our Chris and Marina do housing, land use, and transportation. We'll go to and touch on the other questions we haven't gotten to. Chris, Marina?
Great. Good morning, everyone. Did see some questions in the Q&A about the eviction protection deal, which is tied up with the federal rental assistance money. So I'll be covering that trailer bill from Monday. Then I'm going to kick it over to Marina to cover a couple other housing items, and I'll circle back to talk a little bit about federal transportation funding that was also made available in the COVID relief and omnibus spending bill. So counties will recall that on Monday, we sent an update about the introduction of SB 91 and AB 80, which are parallel identical budget trailer bills. These bills do a couple of things, and it's a pretty complicated structure. The first is they extend the eviction protections that were included in AB 3088 over the summer by Assemblymember Chu, which expires on February 1, otherwise without additional action by the state legislature. So those eviction protections would be extended until June 30th by this trailer bill that's currently under consideration by the legislature. There's also some limited preemption language, very essentially identical to what was included in AB 3088. So local jurisdictions that have their own eviction protection ordinances related to COVID should carefully review those preemption provisions in the current trailer bill language. But essentially, the preemption is just extended to align with the longer now state eviction protections. The core of the eviction protections deal remains essentially tenants that can show some impact from COVID-19. If they pay 25% of the rent due from basically the period that the emergency has been in effect, they can't be evicted. There's a lot of other provisions related to consumer debt and complicated things that CSAC hasn't engaged on really, but those are the core eviction protections that are extended. The bill's especially complicated because it tied together the funding program from the federal relief funding for rental assistance with the eviction deal. I think part of that is a strategic decision. This is a budget trailer bill now because it's appropriating those funds. It can take effect immediately with only a majority vote. So it really has made the discussion very complicated, and the legislation is pretty complex. So I'll talk a little bit now about how the bill deals with the rental assistance funding. And for the purposes of counties, there's really two tracks here. So first, I'll talk about the provisions related to counties with populations under 200,000, and then I'll move into the slightly more complex scenario for the counties of over 200,000 in population, as well as cities with over 200,000 in population. So as everyone recalls, the state received $1.5 billion approximately in rental assistance funding from the federal legislation. Jurisdictions over 200,000 received 1.1 billion directly, and that is not subject to this legislation. You're going to get that funding remitted directly from the Treasury Department. So for the counties under 200,000 population, they're getting allocated, and I should say tenants that live in those counties will be eligible for assistance in proportion to those counties' percentage of the state population. So $150 million from the $1.5 billion available to the state directly is set aside for tenants in counties under 200,000 population. The state is going to administer that program, and there are a lot of provisions in the bill about how they will select a program implementer and how they will work with folks in the communities to ensure that that funding is getting out to folks who are in need. So we have been in conversations with the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. They are very interested in hearing from locals about groups to connect with, how we can connect tenants that need that assistance and landlords that need that assistance with the funding that is available. I do want to make it clear that the $150 million, if you take that as a proportion of the entire $2.6 billion program, it's slightly more than the proportion that those small counties represent of the state's overall population. So there is a clear effort here to make sure that there's geographic equity and that tenants in smaller counties are able to get the assistance. We're going to want to see more details as the contract and the program implementer goes into effect. One of the questions that I saw in the chat was, what's the time frame for getting that assistance out? And the bill includes provisions basically that the contractor who's going to be charged with the statewide implementation has to be able to start accepting applications in early March. So that's included in statute. Moving on to the larger counties, it's slightly more complicated. So I just want to be clear again, this bill does not control how the counties use the direct allocations they received from Treasury. However, the administration is very interested in encouraging counties to align their local programs with those entitlement dollars with the statewide framework. So for counties and cities over 200,000 population, they are eligible to receive an additional state block grant from the 1.5 billion that's going to the state. Again, that is population weighted. It's adjusted. If you have cities over 200,000 in your county, the population for those cities is carved out, but it's a formulaic set aside. In the bill, counties that over 200,000 population have until February 12th to indicate to the state that they would like to receive that block grant funding. The block grant comes with a lot of conditions related to both the targeting and how it interacts with the eviction protections. So for the targeting, it really is consistent with what federal law requires. They initially want to target households under 50% area median income and then broadening that to under 80% area median income. The interaction with the eviction deal is a little more complicated. So the state's program prioritizes assistance going directly to the landlords. And if the landlord opts to participate in the program, up to 80% of back rent from March 2020 until basically the current day can be paid for, those arrearages, provided that the landlord agrees to waive the other 20% of the rental debt. After that, the following priorities are set aside in the bill for additional aid. So prospective rent payments, utility payments, And then there's a kind of open-ended category for other eligible housing-related expenses as defined in the federal legislation. Under the framework, again, if the landlord refuses to participate, a tenant can still participate directly, but under those circumstances, only 25% of the rental arrearages can be paid for with the aid money. For tenants whose landlords refuse to participate, they're also prioritized for additional aid for those subsequent categories, that is prospective rent, utilities, and other housing related expenses. So really the large counties have a decision point approaching very rapidly, provided that this bill passes the legislature by the end of this week, to decide whether or not to simply run your entitlement program on its own and defer to the state to run the broader statewide program in your jurisdiction, or to accept the block grant funds, including all of the conditions laid out in the bill for the use of those funds. And so we will be working with BCSH. We plan to hold a webinar as soon as the bill gets passed this week, assuming it does pass, to provide more information and opportunities for counties to ask questions. But really, that is the core of the framework for the eviction protections and the rental assistance. So I'll look in the chat and see if there are any questions. But for now, let's switch it over to Marina to talk a little bit about the other housing items, and then I can circle back and answer any questions that I see.
Hi, everyone. Marina Espinoza, Legislative Analyst for Housing, Land Use, and Transportation. As Chris mentioned, I'll cover some of the other housing items included in the governor's budget proposal. The proposal does include funding to promote housing development, which we are supportive of. It allocates $500 million to the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, and also includes a request urging the legislature to take early action to approve half of that funding in order to promote construction during the pandemic. And we are encouraging the legislature to include dedicated funding for projects in small and rural communities, and to also use a definition of infill that would be flexible enough to apply in rural and unincorporated areas. And the proposal also includes $500 million in low-income housing tax credits. And in addition to providing funding to promote housing construction, there are also new efforts and new funding included to make sure that jurisdictions are complying with state housing laws. The proposal allocates $2 million to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing for outreach and enforcement to advance fair housing principles. And finally, it includes $4.3 million for a new housing accountability unit to be created within HCD. And the unit would be responsible for providing technical assistance and also monitoring and enforcing housing production laws. And we're waiting for budget trailer bill language on that. If the funding is solely for staff purposes, we shouldn't have concerns with it. But if the language would give HCD any new powers, or if it would impose additional requirements on counties, we would have concerns with it. So we'll keep an eye out for that. And that covers it for housing. I'll turn it back over to Chris to provide the transportation update.
Great, and I'll quickly answer a couple of questions that I see in the Q&A. Supervisor Kreitz asked, for counties under 200,000 population, the application acceptance date of March, I believe it's March 12th, it's something around that. That is for tenants and landlords to apply for assistance. It's not for other providers. And then there's a question about how does the rental assistance program interact with tenants that have housing choice vouchers. I'm going to have to do some additional research on that, and I will get back to the person that answered that question. Not seeing any other additional questions on the rental assistance. Again, we'll be providing a longer write-up on the deal today through the Housing, Land Use, and Transportation Committee and legislative coordinators. You can also refer to the committee analyses that are now available for the two bills and the update that we included on Monday night in our COVID report. So very quickly on transportation, the federal legislation also included about $900 million for California. This is pretty flexible transportation funding designed to cover basically lost fuel tax revenues during the pandemic. So CSAC is working closely with the administration. We're proposing some ways to get that money out to local projects. We're really prioritizing safety improvements, the highway bridge program, and potentially active transportation grants, mostly because those projects are all already through federal grants and therefore not a lot of new soft costs to get federal dollars out to them. So that's what we have for the HLT team. Again, we're available for any questions via email after this, and I'll turn it back over to Darby.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for that. I do want to go to a couple of the questions and then kind of kick it back to Jeff to answer a few. So there was a couple of questions about the CRF and additional funding. I want to note that the governor's budget was put to bed before the federal funding had been approved. And so the budget doesn't reflect a lot of that. And that is something that they are incorporating through budget actions. I also just want to remind people, like the homelessness proposal that the team has talked about. Remember, that's the governor's proposal. And so the legislature has their own thoughts about how that should be changed and altered. And so most or a lot of these proposals will be changed before they hit the end of the road at March or June or whenever the final budget is passed on these areas. I would like Jeff to talk about the rural funding and the audit that kind of talked about that, because there was a lot of advocacy we did. I do want to note that what was the final allocation for rural counties was not, we had spent a lot of time advocating. The governor's original proposal didn't have any funding going to rural counties. And so we want to just really talk about that. But then the second question about broadband, Jeff can talk a little more in detail. The governor did have about a page and a half write-up on it, but there was no specific proposal. We are definitely working with Department of Finance as well as the legislature on getting a broadband proposal done. We think there's a lot to be done in the January early action or February early action that could help if we get the additional federal funds that are coming down for broadband. But Jeff, maybe you can talk on those two items.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to touch very briefly on the fee relief, because there were a couple of questions about that. I'll just take a moment to dispose of. The fees that the governor is proposing to relieve are specifically the license renewal fees for the Alcoholic Beverage Commission and the Board of Barbering and Cosmetology. That's their full, there's no local fees involved. There aren't other state fees that are involved. That's the full 71 million. So it's really just for those state license renewal fees. On the coronavirus relief funds, I think Darby hit the most important point, which was that our main ask was that the state give counties some of the state funding, specifically the counties under 500,000 population that did not get direct federal allocations. One thing, for those of you who did look at the state auditor's release, one thing that it was strangely silent on was the fact that the large counties actually got a very wide range of funding. They did not all get more than the small and mid-sized counties got. There was a very wide range there, which I think changes the analysis somewhat. There's no getting around the fact that counties, if you combine state and federal money, did not all get the same amount of money. But I think to Darby's point, not only did we ask for and get funding for the counties, we ended up getting for counties significantly more than the federal legislation sort of envisioned states giving to the local agencies. So not equal, but we hope that folks can take it for a win that we got not just money for counties, but in fact more money than the federal legislation envisioned locals getting. And certainly we hope that more will be coming from the federal government soon, right? There are obviously proposals that I think many of you are following that maybe go beyond the scope of this webinar, but will be included in our bulletin and other communications going forward. On broadband, sorry, I didn't hit this earlier. It's definitely a big one for us and one that we've been spending a lot of our time on. As Darby said, we are pushing pretty hard for the legislature and the governor to take as many pieces as possible of the Broadband for All Action Plan that was adopted by the California Broadband Council in December and implement it as soon as possible. So some of those are really just state activities that will help coordinate information and inform programs going forward. So for example, some are related to the Master Plan for Aging. Some of them, are really related to schools or the Department of Education. We would like the entire plan to be implemented. Some of it will take a little bit longer. A couple of the big pieces that we want implemented in the short term include better mapping so we can use the money that we have better. And then the big one that is only sort of in the action plan says we should evaluate new revenue sources or new resources for expanding broadband. There are a couple of bills that are already introduced in the legislature, AB 14, SB 4, that would both increase the revenues available for broadband infrastructure and reform the programs that send that money out. And we're asking for those bills to be considered on an accelerated timeline. And so not just, maybe they'll pass by September, October and go into effect on January 1st, because that's a long time from now. And we all know we need to take action sooner than that. And so one of the big asks that's in AB 14 is to extend the charge that funds these farther into the future, and then sell a revenue bond to get that money out the door now and start building the infrastructure and actually getting it out this year. And Graham was in a meeting with the speaker yesterday and several other assembly members who were deeply involved in these conversations, and was able to express the urgency that we know all of you feel on this issue. And then real quick, there was a question about the Gan limit. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's mostly a state issue, but I love these really wonky tax questions, so I want to address it. There is right now an estimate that there's just over $100 million that will exceed the state's constitutional spending limit. It's really preliminary at this point. This will be revised in May. If they do go over their spending limit, half of that money has to go to K-12 schools, and the other half has to go out through a reduction in tax rates, is I think how the Constitution phrases it. So there's definitely talk about which tax rates they would reduce if they do end up returning some money. How equitable does it have to be? Is there ways they can do it to favor certain, but they can't write new tax law to do it. They have to reduce rates is the current thinking. But by the time we get to the May revision, they may very well have found current state spending that they have been counting toward it that they don't need to. For example, we've heard that they might believe that a lot of emergency expenses directly related to the emergency, which there have been a lot of this year, might not count toward that ongoing spending limit. There was also one question about ERAF methodology. It affects a few counties, this excess ERAF issue, and the state controller's office was supposed to come out with guidance to implement the new rules by the end of December, and they have not done so. We don't know whether this means they're finding out that it's actually hard, and maybe counties were doing it right all along, and there was nothing to quibble about, which of course is our position on it, or if there is in fact perhaps some disagreement among different state offices about how exactly it should be implemented, because it is an incredibly complex process. But right now the update is the state hasn't issued the guidance that they were required to issue. So I think it's still an ongoing issue.
Great, Jeff. Thank you. Chris, I see one question, and I'm not sure if we have the answer about how the state's rental assistance program applies to tenants with Section 8 vouchers. Do we know that? Did you answer it already?
Already.
Okay, thanks. All right. So in checking with the team, I don't think we have any more to add. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, we did get some questions if this would be posted. Yes, we'll post it for a short time on our website. And the only reason for a short time is because it becomes out of date at a certain point with all of the budget actions that may be happening. So I want to let you know that part. And then also a lot of the details are in our budget action bulletin that goes out. And so that is on our website, but we will also kind of recommend that you check that out as something to look for more details. Does anything else from the team that I missed? Because there's been a lot of texts going back and forth. If I've missed anything, please holler in now. Otherwise, we want to thank you for spending this hour with us. And we will definitely be doing some more webinars on the rental assistance information that's coming out, especially if it passes this week. And then more to come. And our LEDGE conference will be in May. So there's definitely going to be more coming from CSAC. Thank you all so much and have a great day and stay safe with this crazy weather. All right, bye.